Carlton opened his eyes, disoriented, his head stuffed tight with a massive, pulsing ache. He was half sitting, stiffly propped against a wall, and he found he could not move his arms. His body was covered in little, random places of sharp pain and tingling numbness. He tried to shift away from the discomfort, but he was restrained somehow, and the little moves he could make just made new places hurt. He looked around the room, trying to get his bearings. It looked like a storage room. There were boxes along the walls, and discarded cans of paint and other cleaning supplies littered the floor. But there was more. There were piles of furry fabric everywhere. Carlton peered at them sleepily. He felt muzzy, like if he closed his eyes, he could just fall back asleep. So easily. No. He shook his head hard, trying to clear it, and yelped. "Oh, no," he groaned, as the throbbing in his head demanded attention, and his stomach flipped. He clenched his jaw and closed his eyes, waiting for the pounding and nausea to recede. Eventually they did, fading back to something almost manageable, and he opened his ears again, starting over. This time his mind had cleared a little, and he looked down at his body to see his restraints. Oh no. He was wedged inside the heavy, barrel-shaped torso of a mascot costume, the headless top half of some kind of animal. His arms were trapped inside the torso section, pinned to his sides in an unnatural position by some sort of framework. The arms of the costume hung limp and empty from the sides. His legs stuck out incongruously from the bottom, looking small and thin in contrast. He could feel other things inside the mascot's torso, pieces of metal that pressed against his back and poked into him. He could feel raw patches on his skin, and he could not tell if the thing he felt trickling down his back was sweat or blood. Something was pressing into the sides of his neck. When he turned his head, whatever it was dug into his skin. The costume's fur was dirty and matted, a faded color that might once have been a bright blue, but was now only a bluish approximation of beige. He could see a head of the same color a few feet away, sitting on a cardboard box, and with a flicker of curiosity he looked at it, but he could not tell what it was supposed to be. It looked as if someone had been told, "Make an animal," and had done just that, careful not to make it look like any specific type of animal. He looked around the room, comprehension dawning. He knew where he was. The piles of fabric had faces. They were empty costumes, mascots from the restaurant, deflated collapsed, and staring empty-eyed at him like they wanted something. He looked around, trying to assess calmly, though his heart was fluttering alarmingly in his chest. The room was small, a single bulb overhead lighting it dimly and flickering ever so slightly, giving the place a disquieting impression of movement. A small metal desk fan, brown with rust, gently oscillated in the corner, but the air it blew was heavy with the stale sweat of costumes left unwashed for a decade. Carlton was too hot. The air felt too thick. He tried to stand, but without his arms, he could not brace himself, and as he moved, he felt another violent wave of nausea and a sudden, angry surge of pain in his head. "I wouldn't do that," a raspy voice muttered. Carlton looked around, seeing no one. Then the door opened. It moved slowly, and somewhere beneath his terror, Carlton felt a twinge of impatience. "Who is it? Let me out of this," he said, in panicked desperation. The door squealed like an injured animal as it glided open almost of its own accord, the frame empty. After a moment's pause, a yellow rabbit poked its head around the corner, its ears tilting at a jaunty angle. It was still for a moment, almost posing. Then it came in with a bouncing walk, graceful, with none of the stiff, mechanistic movements of the animatronic animal. It did a small dance step, spun, and took a deep bow. Then it reached up and took off its own head, revealing the man inside the costume. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised," Carlton said, his nerves triggering an automatic wisecrack. "Never trust a rabbit, I say." It didn't make sense. It wasn't funny, but the words were coming out of his mouth without any input from his brain. He still felt sick. His head still ached, but he had a sudden, visceral clarity. This is what happened to Michael. You are what happened to Michael. "Don't speak," Dave said. Carlton opened his mouth to answer back, but the smart remark died on his tongue when he saw the guard's face. He had seemed somehow faded when they met, depleted and ineffectual. But now, as he stood over Carlton in his absurd-looking rabbit costume, he looked different. His face was the same, technically. His gaunt features and sunken eyes, his skin that seemed to have worn thin, ready to snap from strain. But now there was a mean, undeniable strength in him, a rodentine vitality that Carlton recognized. It had occurred to Carlton, years before, that there were two types of nasty people. There were the obvious ones, like his 6th grade English teacher who yelled and threw erasers, or the kid in 5th grade who picked fights with smaller children after school. That type was easy, their offenses public, brutal, and undeniable. But then there was the other kind of petty tyrant, those who grew spiteful with their small scraps of power, feeling more and more abused by the year, by family who did not appreciate them, by neighbors who slighted them in imperceptible ways, by a world that left them somehow lacking something essential. Before him stood someone who had spent so much of his life fighting like a cornered rat that he had taken on the mantle of bitter sadism as an integral part of himself. He would strike out against others and revel in their pain, feeling righteously that the world owed him his cruel pleasures. The god's face, with its malevolent delight in Carlton's pain and fear, was one of the most terrifying things he had ever seen. He opened and closed his mouth, then valiantly found his voice. "What kind of a name for a serial killer is Dave?" he said. It came out as a trembling croak, lacking even the echo of bravado. Dave did not seem to hear him. "I told you not to move, Carlton," he said calmly. He set the rabbit's head down on a plastic crate and began fiddling with the fastenings at the back of his neck. "It's not an order. It's a friendly warning. Do you know what I've put you in?" "Your girlfriend," Carlton said, and Dave made a thin curve of a smile. "You're amusing," he said with distaste. "But no, you're not wearing a costume, Carlton. Not precisely. You see, these suits were designed for two purposes: to be worn by men like me." He gestured fluidly toward himself with something that might have been pride, and to be used as working animatronics like the ones you see on the stage. Do you understand? Carlton nodded, or began to, but Dave's raised eyebrow stopped him. "I said don't move," he said. The neck of his costume came open, and he began to undo a second fastening at his back as he talked. "You see, all of the animatronic parts in that suit are still in it. They are simply held back by spring locks, like this." Dave went to the pile of costumes and selected one, bringing the fuzzy green torso, headless, over to Carlton. He held out the costume, waggling two twisted pieces of metal that were attached to the sides of the neck. "These are spring locks," he said, bringing the piece of metal so close to Carlton's face he almost could not focus his eyes on it. "Watch." He did something, touched some piece of the lock so imperceptibly that Carlton could not see what he had done, and it snapped shut with a sound like a backfiring car. Carlton stiffened, suddenly taking the order not to move deathly seriously. That's a very old costume, one of the first ones Henry made. You can trip these spring locks very, very easily if you don't know what you're doing, Dave went on. It takes almost no movement at all. Henry, Carlton said, trying to focus on what he was being told. He could still hear the snap, as if it had lodged in his head like a song that kept repeating. I'm going to die, he thought for the first time since waking. This man will kill me. I will die. And then what? Will anyone even know? He set his jaw and met Dave's eyes. Who's Henry? Henry, Dave repeated. Your friend Charlie's father. He looked surprised. Did you not know that he made this place? Oh, right. Well, Carlton said confusedly. I just always thought of him as Charlie's dad. Of course, Dave said, the kind of polite murmur people made when they didn't care. Well, that's one of his first suits, he said, gesturing at Carlton. And if you trigger those spring locks, two things will happen. First, all the locks will snap right into you, making deep cuts all over your body. And a split second later, all the animatronic parts they've been holding back, all that sharp steel and hard plastic, will instantly be driven into your body. You will die. But it will be slow. You'll feel your organs punctured. The suit will grow wet with your blood, and you will know you're dying for long, long minutes. You'll try to scream, but you will be unable to. Your vocal cords will be severed, and your lungs will fill with your own blood until you drown in it. There was a faraway look in his eyes, and Carlton knew with chilling certainty that Dave wasn't predicting. He was reminiscing. How... Carlton's voice broke, and he tried again. How do you know that? He said, managing a raspy whisper. Dave met his eyes and smiled widely. How do you think? He set down the costume he was holding and reached up to undo the final piece of his own. It took time. Carlton watched for several minutes as Dave romanced whatever mechanisms lay under the collar. He took the costume torso off with a flourish, and Carlton made an involuntary sound, a helpless and frightened mewl. Dave had been shirtless under the costume, and now his bare chest was clearly visible even in the dim, flickering light. His skin was horribly scarred, with raised white lines that scored his flesh in a symmetrical pattern, each side of his body mirroring the other. Dave saw him looking and laughed, a sudden happy sound. Carlton shivered at it. Dave raised his arms out from his body and turned slowly in a circle, giving Carlton ample time to see that the scars were everywhere, covering his back like a faint lace shirt, stretching to the waist of the rabbit pants as if they continued all the way down. On the back of his neck, where they were largest and most visible, two scars like parallel lines were etched from the nape of his neck all the way up to his scalp, disappearing into his hair. Carlton tried to swallow. His mouth was so dry he could not have spoken, even if there had been anything to say. Dave smiled unpleasantly. "Don't move," he said again.